On the morning of August 15th, 1723, Peter the Great officially opened Peterhof to an audience of foreign envoys and Russian dignitaries. They saw a marble cascade pouring toward the sea, a canal that let boats sail from the Gulf of Finland almost to the foot of the palace, and dozens of fountains running without a single pump. What most of them did not fully register was where the host had slept the night before. Not in the grand palace on the ridge, built to be seen from the water. He had slept in a small brick house at the edge of the shore, 6 rooms and an entrance hall, with a bedroom barely adequate for its owner, a man who stood about 6 feet 8 inches tall, just over 2 meters. He ruled an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, and his favorite residence was smaller than the homes of Dutch merchants he had once worked alongside as a hired carpenter. That contradiction ran through his entire day, and nowhere was it more visible than in the morning. So follow him through a single summer morning at Peterhof in the early 1720s, from the moment he woke to the moment he sat down to his midday meal. And almost nothing in it will match what a royal morning in Europe was supposed to look like. The day usually began between 3 and 4 in the morning. That sounds less brutal when you know the geography. Peterhof sits at nearly 60 degrees north, and in June and July, the sun rises before 5, after a night that never gets fully dark. Witnesses from across his life agree on the schedule. Gilbert Burnet, an English bishop who spent time with him in 1698, wrote that he rose early and gave the whole morning to business, until 10 or 11 at the latest. A French official who observed him at Dunkirk in 1717 reported that he got up early, dined around 10, took supper toward 7, and was in bed before 9. In other words, he kept the working hours of a ship's master, not of a monarch, and by the time most European courts were opening their eyes, he had already completed half a working day. Burnet added another detail that astonished readers of his memoirs. The tsar went about without personal guards. The routine itself was portable. Peterhof was a residence for the warm months, roughly May to October, and when the court withdrew to St. Petersburg for the winter, the same hours, the same paperwork, and the same habits simply moved with him. But it was here, on the shore, that the pattern showed most clearly. The room he woke in still exists. The bedroom of Montplaisir, the small seaside house he began in 1714, was paneled in oak, and the museum that occupies it today preserves his nightcap, his towel, his washing jug, and a quilt said to have been sewn by his wife Catherine. Montplaisir was his own project in the most literal sense. He chose the spot on the shoreline, reportedly so that he could watch ships passing to and from the new naval base at Kronstadt, and he produced the sketches that fixed the site, the internal layout, and elements of the decoration, which architects like Andreas Schluter, Johann Braunstein, and Jean-Baptiste Leblanc then turned into a building. The result looked like a prosperous Dutch merchant's house, brick with a high pyramidal roof, and Russians came to call it the Dutch house. The sea began a few steps from its northern windows, and he is recorded as saying that sea air did him more good than any medicine. The house served a practical function too. Standing on the route between the capital and the Kronstadt roadstead, it was where he stopped when sailing to and from Europe. And it held a surprise for anyone expecting bare walls, because its galleries were hung with several hundred European paintings he had bought abroad, mostly Dutch and Flemish canvases, with a heavy emphasis on ships and the sea, a collection often described as the first picture gallery in Russia. The most powerful man in the empire kept his art in a cottage. His nights, it should be said, were not easy. From youth, witnesses described sudden convulsive movements of his face and shoulder that he could not control, especially under stress. A collection of anecdotes attributed to Andrei Nartov, his personal mechanic, adds that the seizures could strike at night and that the emperor disliked sleeping alone. When Catherine was away, he supposedly had the orderly Prokofy Mirzin lie beside him and fell asleep gripping the man's shoulders. Historians treat that collection with caution, since it may have been polished by Nartov's son decades after the events, but the men it mentions were real. The orderlies, called denshchiki, were soldier attendants drawn from service families who slept within call and were the first faces of his day. It was a strange job, part valet, part bodyguard, part witness, and it could launch a career. One of these orderlies, Vasily Suvorov, later became a general and fathered Alexander Suvorov, the most celebrated commander in Russian history. What happened next is where the contrast with the rest of Europe becomes almost comical. At Versailles, the king's rising was a state ceremony, the lever, in which dozens of courtiers entered the bedchamber in strict order of rank, and handing the royal shirt was a privilege men schemed for years to obtain. Peter washed from a jug and dressed in minutes, mostly without help. His wardrobe was a recurring subject of amusement in diplomats' letters, a plain dark caftan of heavy cloth, or the green coat of the Preobrazhensky Guards, the regiment he had founded as a boy and in which he insisted on holding earned rank and drawing the corresponding pay. He wore thick-soled shoes built for walking, a worn hat, and no wig over his own short dark hair. Memoirists noted that his stockings had been darned more than once, and that he saw no reason to discard a coat that still functioned. The irony was fully visible to his contemporaries, because this was the same ruler whose decrees had forced the entire Russian nobility out of their traditional long robes and into French fashion, with fines for anyone who resisted. The man who legislated appearances for a whole empire was, by a wide margin, its least fashionable subject. His first refreshment matched the wardrobe. Accounts of his habits report that he liked to start the day with a small glass of anise-flavored vodka, sometimes chased with a pickled cucumber, and foreign visitors summoned to an 8 o'clock reception recorded their surprise at being offered spirits where they had expected coffee or tea. It was not decadence by the standards of his circle, it was simply how he started the day, and then he went to work. The mornings, as Burnet observed, belonged to business, and at Montplaisir the architecture was arranged around exactly that. The western suite of the house held 3 rooms in a row, a room for the secretary, the bedroom, and, in the seaward corner, the naval study. The flow of paper into that corner was constant. His cabinet secretary, Alexei Makarov, managed dispatches from the Senate and the administrative colleges in St. Petersburg, roughly 30 kilometers east, along with ambassadors' reports and petitions, and Peter drafted and corrected documents in his own hand, a hand famous among his clerks for being nearly illegible. The output of these mornings shaped Russia for 2 centuries. The Table of Ranks of 1722, which made state service rather than bloodline the basis of noble rank, and the Decree of 1724 founding the Academy of Sciences, which opened only after his death. He had told the Senate as early as 1711 that lost time, like death, could not be reversed, and he ran his mornings accordingly. From the naval study, its walls faced with Dutch tiles painted with 13 different types of ships, he could see Kronstadt to the left and St. Petersburg to the right on a clear day, which meant that the 2 great projects of his reign, the fleet and the capital, were both visible from the desk where he signed their budgets. Somewhere in these early hours, on many days, came the lathe. Turning wood and ivory on a lathe was his lifelong obsession, and wherever he settled, a turnery followed. In his St. Petersburg residence, the workshop stood directly beside his private rooms and often functioned as his real office, a place where sensitive political meetings were held among the machines, with entry allowed only by his permission, and the door watched by orderlies. The master of that workshop, Andrei Nartov, served as his personal turner from 1712 to 1725, and was a serious engineer in his own right, credited with an early lathe featuring a mechanized tool-supporting carriage, an ancestor of modern machine tools. Objects finished by the emperor's own hands survive. An ivory snuff box he presented to a countess, commemorative medallions of his battles, and a chandelier with 27 candle holders now kept in the Hermitage. In 1717, during his visit to Paris, he demonstrated the skill in public, shaping a piece of ivory before the members of the Royal Academy of Sciences, which then elected him a member. He was reportedly proud of the calluses on his hands and treated manual competence not as a hobby but as a qualification for ruling, on the logic that a sovereign who could not build anything had no business judging the people who could. By 6 or 7 he was usually outdoors, and this was the part of the morning his companions dreaded because inspection meant walking, and his walking pace was a documented complaint. He took enormous strides, and visitors of ordinary height described having to trot to keep up while he asked rapid questions about budgets, timber, and pipe diameters. What he was walking through, for most of the years covered here, was a construction site. The name Peterhof a Dutch and German compound meaning Peter's Court, first appears in his papers in 1705 as a landing stage used on crossings to Kronstadt, and serious building began in 1714. He had originally wanted his main seaside residence at Strelna, closer to the capital, but the engineers concluded that the site could not deliver enough natural water pressure for the fountains he was planning, so the whole project moved to Peterhof, where the land rises about 16 meters from the shore in a natural terrace. The design pointed at the sea from the start. The sea channel was dug from the Gulf to the foot of the central cascade, precisely so that guests could sail from St. Petersburg and step off almost at the palace, and that channel, like the parks and canals around it, was dug by hand, by soldiers and conscripted peasants working under the same harsh labor system that had raised St. Petersburg itself at the cost of thousands of lives. The fountains celebrated victories won and were built by people who had no say in either. The walk could take in the whole growing ensemble. At the western end of the lower park stood the compact Marly Palace, finished between 1721 and 1723, and named after a French royal retreat he had seen outside Paris in 1717. And by the shore a small two-story pavilion called the Hermitage was rising, designed for private dinners held beyond the hearing of servants. Every part of it had a schedule, and the emperor knew the schedules. He did not supervise this work the way a client supervises a contractor. Surviving plans carry corrections in his own hand, and the museum's records note that even when he was traveling abroad, he sent back detailed instructions for the interiors of Montplaisir. The professional roster under him was genuinely international. Braunstein supervised construction on site. Leblanc, a pupil of the designer of the Versailles Gardens, arrived in 1716 and shaped the master plan until his death in 1719. The Italian Niccolo Michetti took over the cascade, and a young Russian, Mikhail Zemtsov, learned the trade beside them. But the estate's central technical idea belonged to the owner, and it concerned water. Versailles, the residence Peterhof was built to answer, had a water problem it never solved. Its fountains were fed by the Machine de Marly, a gigantic installation of 14 paddle wheels pumping water up from the Seine, and even that was not enough. The gardeners ran the fountains section by section, switching them on as the king approached and off behind his back. Peter wanted a system with no pumps at all, and in August 1720 he rode inland to inspect springs on the Ropsha Heights, roughly 22 kilometers south of Peterhof and about 100 meters above sea level. The conclusion was simple. Gravity alone could do the work if someone built the channel. The someone was Vasily Tuvolkov, a Russian engineer Peter had earlier sent to study hydraulics in Holland and France, and construction, ordered in November 1720, took about 8 months. The first trial jets played on July 13, 1721, and on August 8th of that year, Peter traveled to Ropsha and personally opened the sluice that sent the water on its way. The finished network eventually comprised a canal of about 24 kilometers, 22 dams, 18 storage ponds, and roughly 40 kilometers of conduits in total, and it required not one machine. It still works on the same principle 3 centuries later, and by modern estimates it moves on the order of 100,000 cubic meters of water on a full operating day, which is why the guests of 1723 saw something Versailles could not show them. Every jet in the estate playing at once, for hours, with nothing burning fuel and nobody turning a crank. From 1721, day-to-day care of the jets belonged to Russia's first fountain crew under a French master, Paul Suellem. But when the emperor was in residence, checking the water was part of his own morning circuit, because every fountain served, in effect, a diplomatic purpose, and a dry one in front of a foreign envoy would have been a small international incident. It is worth pausing on what a visitor in his lifetime would and would not have seen. The Grand Cascade, begun in May 1716, was running by the opening, along with the sea channel and a first generation of fountains. The Bull fountains from 1721, the Atom fountain from 1722, and, in 1723 and 1724, the Pyramid, the Dragon Cascade, and others being connected one by one. What no visitor saw in his lifetime was the estate's most famous object. The gilded statue of Samson tearing open the jaws of a lion, the centerpiece of every modern photograph, was installed only in 1735, a decade after Peter's death, to mark the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Poltava, which had been fought on the feast day of Saint Samson, against a Swedish king whose coat of arms carried a lion. The image everyone now associates with Peterhof is one its creator never laid eyes on. Toward 11 o'clock, sometimes noon, came the main meal of the day, which he called dinner and ate at an hour when Versailles was barely finishing breakfast. The menu, recorded in the memoir literature around his court, was the food of a prosperous farm rather than a palace: cabbage soup, cold meat in aspic, buckwheat porridge, roast meat served with pickled cucumbers or salted lemons, corned beef, ham, and a particular weakness for pungent Limburger cheese. His cook, Johann Felten, served all of it, and one detail startled contemporaries enough to be written down repeatedly. He never ate fish, the default food of a country crossed by rivers and bound by orthodox fasting rules. He drank kvass, the mildly alcoholic fermented rye drink of Russian peasants. Throughout the day, preferred anise vodka among spirits, and at dinner took hermitage, a red wine from the Rhone, or Hungarian Tokay. His biographer Robert Massey also records a fondness for brandy laced with hot pepper. He liked watermelon, fresh or pickled, and favored apples and oranges among fruits. He ate fast in small company and had little patience for banquet protocol, which he escaped whenever politics allowed. At Montplaisir this was easy because the eastern wing of the house held the kitchen and the pantry, faced with blue and white Delft tiles from a bulk order of reportedly around 100,000 that he had placed in Holland, and household accounts say that Catherine herself sometimes cooked for guests there, an empress at the stove being roughly as unthinkable in Vienna or Paris as an emperor at a lathe. Catherine deserves a moment in this picture, because the informality of these mornings was partly her doing. Born Marta Skavronskaya, a Livonian servant girl captured during the war, she became his companion, then his wife in a public wedding in 1712. And in May 1724, he crowned her empress with his own hands, the first such coronation in Russian history. She had followed him on military campaigns to the Pruth in 1711 and to Persia in 1722, drank with his veterans, and matched his indifference to ceremony. Their daughters spent summers at Peterhof as children: Anna, born in 1708, and Elizabeth, born in 1709, who would later, as empress, hire the architect Rastrelli to enlarge her father's modest upper chambers into the enormous Baroque Grand Palace that visitors photograph today. In this, as in the Samson Fountain, the Peterhof of the postcards is largely the work of the daughter. The father's Peterhof was lower, plainer, and closer to the water. There was one more fixed point before the morning ended, and it says as much about him as the lathe. After dinner, he slept. Envoys noted the after-dinner nap as an unbreakable institution, kept even during festivities. He was known to withdraw from his own parties for an hour and returned refreshed to guests who, under his house rules, were not permitted to leave, and who risked the penalty goblet, a vessel called the Great Eagle, holding about 1.5 liters of wine, if they broke the rules of the evening. But that belongs to the afternoon and the night. By noon, the part of the day that actually governed Russia was over. He had been awake for roughly 8 hours, had processed the state's paperwork, inspected a construction site, checked a hydraulic system, possibly turned ivory on a lathe, and eaten a farmer's dinner, all before the hour at which many European sovereigns received their first official visitor. None of this was a lifestyle quirk, and he knew it. Russia had crushed the Swedish army at Poltava in 1709, and in 1721, the Treaty of Neustadt ended 21 years of war and confirmed Russian possession of the Baltic coast where Peterhof now stood. That autumn, the Senate proclaimed him emperor, a title Europe's older courts accepted slowly and grudgingly. Peterhof was part of the argument for taking it seriously. A residence that did what Versailles did, on the shore of a sea Russia had just gained through war, with fountains that ran all day on gravity alone, while the French originals had to be rationed. The ambassadors who attended the opening in August 1723 were the real audience, because their letters home were the medium through which Russia's new status would be believed or doubted. That is why the water system received the emperor's personal mornings, and why the estate had to be flawless even while he himself dressed in darned stockings. Since the point was never his personal comfort, the palace was addressed to Europe. The comfort was optional. He had less time left than anyone at that opening knew. Through 1724 his health declined, and on February 8, 1725, he died in St. Petersburg at the age of 52, leaving the empire, under his own succession law, to Catherine. The dynasty treated Montplaisir as a memorial from then on and left its interiors essentially untouched for 200 years. The house was gravely damaged during the German occupation in the Second World War, and its restoration took decades. The Chinese-style lacquer panels of his study, destroyed in the war, had to be recreated by modern craftsmen. Yet the nightcap, the washing jug, and the quilt can still be seen in the bedroom where those mornings began. The estate around it kept growing for 2 more centuries, gilded, enlarged, and photographed until the small brick house became easy to walk past. It still explains the place better than anything else on the grounds. If you want to know what Russia was announcing to the world in 1723, look at the Grand Cascade. If you want to know who was doing the announcing, look at the 6-room house by the water, where a man of 6 feet 8 slept under a homemade quilt, rose at 4, poured his own vodka, answered his own mail, and went out to check the pipes.